I know you've written a lot about hope, about its effects on how people live their lives, about how African Americans, especially, if you give up hope.
Mm.
And,
Mm.
I want to talk about that and also kind of get into how people regain it and just the power of hope in people's lives.
Well, hope is one of the most precious virtues because it sustains one. There's such good reasons to despair, just for anybody, but I mean, especially people of African descent in America, given the depths of America's hypocrisy about who it thinks it is and who it actually is. So that when you reach the point where you feel as if the evidence is so overwhelming regarding your own destruction, be it psychic, be it existential, or sometimes outright physical, as in the case of Diallo and other brothers who were just shot down by trigger happy police. Um, it makes it difficult for one to think of even taking good care of oneself in the face of a future that is so bleak and grim.
And do you think that people then, no, that's okay. People then would have more of a chance, or they'd be more inclined to smoke, to drink, to
Oh,
have
sure.
bad lifestyles.
Just,
Could you talk
just
about?
yeah, just forms of slow but sure self-destructive behavior. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you reach a point where you care less about yourself and your future because you feel as if the future has less to offer you.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just go day by day with kind of slow self-destruction, with drinking and smoking and not taking care of yourself. You should go to the doctor, but you don't. Not simply because you're procrastinating, but you figure that maybe your body's not worth enough value. Most society doesn't think it is. Why should you think your body's worth that much value to even take care of it? You see, it's been so degraded and associated with so much distrust, and it's associated with so much threat. The sheer presence of the black male body is such a threat to most people in the society. Why should you take that good care of it? You see, I think that's part of the internalizing of white supremacist self-perceptions that's pervasive. No doubt about it. That's what needs to be fought continually, daily, perennially. But it's a difficult battle. It's almost Sisyphean, like you're pushing the rock up a hill,
Mm-hmm.
and it just rolls right back down.
And maybe just talk a little bit more about how racism, maybe even more specifically, impacts one's hope.
I think it functions in a number of different ways in relation to different peoples and different classes and different genders. Generally speaking, I think at its worst, what racism does is to undermine any grounds for respect for people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes in a number of different ways. You could be a high-powered lawyer in a firm, but if you're still not respected by your colleagues, then you still have to deal with a certain kind of struggle. It's very different than a homeless black sister on the street, for example, who might be disrespected, but she has no access to resources or even any social status that society would deem of value. But at that level of disrespect, it does cut across class and cuts across gender, cuts across sexual orientation, you see. Um, and this is why the quest for hope is a quest for self-respect among people who've been so hated and haunted and hunted down as people of color, especially black folk in America. So I think first and foremost is a question of respect. I mean, you think, for example, for not to have the right to bury one's own loved ones. You see, we saw that in the European Holocaust, the Judeocidal attacks on Jewish brothers and sisters, where they could not even aspire to the level of dignity in which they could bury their own loved ones in the concentration camps. And that's what happened during American slavery as well, and black people could not even bury their loved ones. That's probably the deepest form of dehumanization, because you're disrespecting people right at the moment when they are most human, when they're weeping for their beloveds. And that has a deep effect on one's soul. You see, you got bruised souls and scarred souls, and that's what black folk, that's what we've had ever since.
Yeah.
It's deeply bruised and scarred souls. And most of the mainstream, they don't either understand it or won't understand. It's like the Diallo case here, where the brother was shot dead. There was not one white commentator who mentioned Miss Diallo's tears, the mother's tears for her son. Not one. That's disrespect. It's not even a question of politics. Not a question of ideology. Saw the tears of the police, and we heard the political discourse about the problem that Diallo case presents. But when it comes to the tears of the mother who lost a son, who she knows he's innocent, everybody knows he's innocent. It's not a question of who should pay, revenge, just her tears.
Right.
See, America does not have enough courtesy and decency to stop and focus on her tears for a moment. You see, why? Because these black folk been crying all these years. You see, they're used to it. They strong enough. They can make it. That kind of disrespect, you see. And that's at the source of a lot of the rage. See, a lot of people don't realize that the rage really has less to do with simply political revenge or even justice, because justice is still a political construct. But when you actually look at the deeper level of respect and disrespect, that's where the rage really comes from, see. And, it doesn't surface hardly at all. And I think at that point, people begin to say, well, America really doesn't have the potential or the capacity to remain at a level where it can speak to these kind of issues of white supremacy. Why should I sustain my hope? And that does relate to then stress, pressure, lack of self-care, or even forms of self-medication, drugs, crack house, alcoholism, or whatever, you see. And it's another example of how racism kills people indirectly, psychically, spiritually, physically, and then it's bequeathed to the next generation, dealing with early death. How they gonna deal with it, you see. So it's a, I applaud you all for reflecting on this, because the heart is a strange territory. It can be very dreadful and it can be very joyful, but it's a very strange territory. Sometimes that heart is angry, sometimes that heart is full of rage, sometimes it's full of sorrow, sometimes it's full of love and compassion.
No, I know, and you get back to, you think that that a mother's sorrow,
Yeah.
if anything, should cross
If
all.
if that can't be a source of humanizing,
Right.
what can? You
No,
see, what can?
I know.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So, how does one maintain their hope? How does an African American, how does somebody, what do you do? Where do people go?
It's a good question. Some don't maintain their hope. Some do. They come up with a lot of different equipments for living, a lot of different strategies for surviving. Religion has played a very important role, but religion can easily peddle a false hope or a cheap optimism rather than a genuine hope. But it has played a very important role. Of course, family, love, connections, ties of empathy, and bonds of sympathy have played a very important role. The ecstasy of achievement in athletics and sports has played an important role. But we also forget the many thousands, both gone and here, who do lose hope. And they're the ones who tend to be anonymous, die from their heart attacks, strokes, stress, and so on, you see. Become another statistic in the American record. But they're very much part of the killing field, actually. We understand that in the indirect way, sometimes directly, but with bullets, but the indirect way, the slow process of death that sets in, you see. But I think probably in the end, it's been music, that very, very special, privilege, cultural tradition that has preserved black sanity and humanity. But music is usually ensconced in ritual, either in church or mosque or synagogue or temple or more secular ritual on Friday night at the nightclub, Saturday night at the nightclub or whatever. But some transcendence to get distant from the pain that provides some source of hope. Yeah, that's true.
Almost all of the people that I've talked with of color have said that they pretty much can't and haven't spent a day of their life without experiencing racism in one way or another. Could you talk about that? Has that been your experience? I'm just gonna lower this down.
Sure.
A little bit.
Sure.
Has that been your experience at all?
Well, see, I don't really enumerate different experiences like that, you know. I mean, certainly the consciousness of being part of a people who were spit on and lynched and mothers and sisters raped and so forth is part of your everyday consciousness. You don't dwell on it, but it's always already there, no doubt. You don't want to be paralyzed. You don't want to, in any way, demonize others whose ancestors may have made their own contributions to your subjugation because they're free agents. They make their own choices. Many of them are actually quite supportive of struggles against white supremacy. But sure, it's always there in your everyday consciousness. That's really what it means to be black in America, to be at risk. If you're at risk, you have to be very cognizant and alert to what's coming at you at the micro-social level, on the ground, on the larger macro-social level in terms of policies, various activities at the workplace, with the police and so on. But it's not, it's not the kind of thing that just gets you down. You keep moving. You know in some sense you're already trapped. We're all trapped in space and time anyway, but I mean, you thicken the trap with different forms and structures of domination and different perceptions and different stereotypical views about you, that you're trapped. The question is to find some space within the trap so you can breathe and be yourself and have some fun and smile and get on about your business. Very much so.
And what advice could you give people, or what would you talk to people about how to cope? What are the tools? Are there any tools that you can share for people to regain hope in their own life and to survive?
Oh, sure. I think that we ought not to be surprised when we're disappointed, when we're disheartened and disillusioned, that's part and parcel of the way the world is, the way our lives are, and that therefore that ought not to be, they ought not to be blows. Disappointment and frustration are not to be blows that stop you from persisting and in the end prevailing. That hope for me is really a question of just staying in motion, like water in the river. You have to just keep moving, keep pushing, keep fighting, keep keeping on. But in doing that, you know that there's always going to be the arrows coming at you. There's always going to be the moments of very deep disappointment. It's only if one is a cheap sentimentalist that one somehow would be paralyzed by disappointment and become a cynic. And two options you want to avoid are sentimentalism and cynicism. Those are the two most vicious forms of being alive in the world. One is cheaply optimistic and the other is paralyzingly pessimistic. And the question is, how do you stay right in the middle? And that's what the blues is. That's a blues sensibility, to know how bad things are and still have a smile on your face, love in your heart, and keep fighting for something that for the most part won't come about in your lifetime. Maybe never.
Mm-hmm.
You see, will black people ever be fundamentally respected? Probably never. White supremacy is too deep in modernity, and we in modernity for good.
Mm-hmm.
You see, will women ever be fundamentally respected? Probably never. Patriarchy is too deep. Does that mean we don't fight for it? No. Does that mean there won't be some women who are respected? No. There'll be more and more. But patriarchal ideology, the white supremacist ideology, permeates and saturates every nook and cranny of not just America, but our world. And so the question is, well, do we have enough intellectual honesty to look the future in the face? And we don't see heaven or paradise, but we see possibilities for betterment. And that, for me, is what hope is all about. Movement toward those ideals that will, for the most part, never be fully realized in the world. And that, to me, is a sign of maturity, because it means that no matter what happens, you'll never break.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never stop fighting. You'll never give up the quest for your own self-respect, integrity of others, and so forth.
I was reminded of a story recently that a friend went to a wedding in Northern Ireland, a Catholic girl and Protestant boy, and he's American, was over there, and was surprised because he was in the back with one of the ushers, and people were coming in, and he was like, oh, Protestant, Catholic, Catholic, Protestant, Protestant, Catholic.
Wow.
And he said to him, they all look like ruddy-faced
Right,
Irish.
right,
And
exactly.
he said, well, how is it that you can tell the difference? And he said, well, because it matters.
Wow. Wow.
And that gets me to race is a social construct.
Absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we know that race as a category only emerges at a particular historical moment. There had been some color prejudice, there had been some color differentiation. But race as a category, it was first introduced by Francois Bernier in a paper in 1688 in France. And it doesn't become part of a so-called scientific discourse until Linnaeus in 1735, his natural history. And of course, he's one of the towering figures, not just in France, but in European sciences. And by the 18th century, you've got a full-scale discourse of racial hierarchy. Europeans at the top, Africans at the bottom. By the 19th century, it becomes not simply a quote-unquote science, but becomes part of popular discourse in ways that had not been the case 200 years before at all. You see, take a great African like Augustine of the 4th and 5th century. He was an African, probably roughly the same color I was, part of the Roman Empire. Nobody made that big a deal about it. You see, so race didn't matter as much. Hugh hardly mattered as much. He was a Roman imperial elite from Carthage, Northern Africa, you see. Make that big a difference. Pushkin in Russia, it did make a difference. He was quite explicit about his African heritage and so on, but it didn't make a difference in the way it does in America. You see, there's something about America, there's something about South Africa, there's something about Nazi Germany, 3 nations that stand out. They're part of a spectrum in which race matters, but they stand out because they're obsessed, that their collective identities were predicated in part on these discourses of degraded others. Black, white, red, German, Jew, and so forth. And it's a dark tale that most Americans would rather not hear, because there's some wonderful things about the country, no doubt about that. That's part of the tragedy of the country. It's got so much unbelievable potential, and yet at the same time it was predicated on such profound hypocrisy when it comes to white supremacy.
It's interesting that you bring up Nazi Germany, because it's just brought to mind that there's a lot of things that I've read really state that the fact that they were limiting the available people that they could gather knowledge and talent,
Sure.
that they were wasting such a valuable portion of their society. That really contributed to them losing the war. We obviously are doing the same thing in this country. Could you talk about that, about the waste, about the people that are being, just this resource?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in terms of the talents and so it's a little different in Nazi Germany because you were talking about a Jewish people who had 2,000 years of history of commentary on texts, where the literary texts themselves were one of the fundamental pillars of their identity. Whereas in this country, you had basically a rural people and an oral people, and for over 200 some years it was against the law for them to learn how to read. And so black people were confined oftentimes to the lowest echelons of the economy. You did have tremendously talented black writers and artists and so forth, but it was a very small slice because of the slavery and the Jim Crow. So you're right. Oh my God, the black talent in so many different ways and forms could have contributed so much to America, but America made it very clear that it needed a permanent underdog that would serve as the basis upon which its democracy would flower and flourish, you see. So it could flower and flourish for Americans of European descent if they worked hard enough. And the American dream oftentimes was very real for hundreds of thousands of hard-working Americans of European descent. But locked into slavery and Jim Crow, whether in fact this permanent underdog status was a precondition for the successes of American democracy for Americans of European descent is a fundamental question. Fundamental question. Sacrificial lambs for the feast. You see, were never invited to the feast. It's a hell of a predicament to be in, especially in a land of dreams and liberty and freedom. And plenty too. Absolutely right. Now, the last 30 years, we've seen some changes and some significant progress, but for the most part, when you look at the majority of black folk who are lower middle and below, and the condition of their children, it's still not a pretty sight, even given the boom, all of the self-congratulation and self-celebration in the country and so forth. But what happens, escalation of incarceration of young men and at levels that either you have to believe that young black men are genetically disposed toward criminal behavior, or you don't care, because there's no discourse about it. There's no discourse about it. See, wow. How many is it going to take? You already got almost 5% of all young black men between 18 and 26 in jail. Almost 31% connected through pardon and parole. If people believe that somehow we just disposed of this, then they should just say it, and we got to work on the biology. If we don't, it must have something to do with the environment. Maybe we ought to talk about the environment. Maybe we ought to try to hit it head on. You see what I mean? So there's still some sacrificial lambs. It's like Giuliani's New York City. See, he's going to clean up the city. What does clean up mean? Well, we're going to pull in 46,000 young black men under the street unit. Well, we're going to arrest about 3% of them, but we're going to stop and frisk them, and we're going to bring them in. So you're cleaning up. Well, cleaning up for who? The middle-class tourists from around the world. Who pays the cost? The same ones. They're used to paying the cost. You see, Giuliani gets 70-something%. It's not just his fault. People vote for Giuliani, you know what I mean? Oh, yes, absolutely right.
Oh, and it looks like he may move further up in this.
Absolutely right.
Frightening.
No, but I mean, and he's not all by himself. There's a lot of Giuliani-like figures all around the country in different levels of elected office, very much so.
Well, when we would get back to it.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm sorry to go off a bit though, but.
When we talked and I showed you the treatment originally, you had mentioned about that you had personal experience that you had with people in your life, people in your family, friends, who've either died or just suffered with cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, all that.
Mm.
It seems to really be part of the African American
Oh,
experience.
definitely.
Could you talk about that, maybe your own personal
Well, I think
experience?
it's a human response to have a high blood pressure and to respond to stress and pressure by trying to evade and escape the pain that results from that. So you end up with eating habits, drinking habits. You end up with, as I mentioned before, a certain distance from the doctors, and even dentists and so forth. It's a very human thing. It's not the best thing to do, but it is a human thing to do. And we do need more serious, not just education, but we need more attempts to thoroughly persuade black men and women to be more respectful of themselves and caring of themselves. That's one of the good things about your documentary here, because part of it is a personal decision. You see. Do you really want to care and respect for yourself? Do you really want to live? It's a tough question. It's a tough question for all of us, in some sense, but it's a very tough question. Now, if you live for your mother, father, you live for your child, you live for your wife or husband or something, you can answer it a little more easily. But when you ask, are you living for yourself? Not in a selfish way, but living for yourself in terms of yourself being that person who is cared for by you, not by anybody else. You see, that's a profound question for any human being, because you have to really look deep inside of your soul and feel as if there's things about you that are worth preserving, so you're not simply living a life for others or others dependent on you, but just you. And I think when people ask themselves that question, when many black people ask themselves that question, they have to wrestle for a while. It's not an automatic answer. And a lot of times their reluctance to go to a doctor or a dentist, or their feeling overwhelmed by these ugly forms of stress and strain and pressure, it's an implicit response to that question. Maybe they don't think they're worth it. You see, that's terrifying. You think about it. It really is. Unless we conclude that maybe death is not all that bad a thing anyway. Maybe death is desirable. Maybe death is the only form of deliverance for people trapped. It's not a pleasant thought. One doesn't want to believe it. But it could be the case, actually. At least that is what is implicitly said in the practices of persons who don't care enough for themselves or respect themselves enough. That in part they're saying, Thanatos, death wish, that's what's really operating. That's what I really want. And, that means you got a people who are under the grip of death every day, psychically, spiritually, socially, and physically. That's not the America that most of the world knows.
No, that's right.
Not at all.
So, what would be the vision? Where do we go?
The vision is that you get to the best by going through the worst. You have to confront the darkness in order for the light to really have any weight and gravity. And you confront the darkness by being very honest about both the facts, the empirical facts, as well as the significance of those facts for the people who are undergoing the suffering, with statistics, heart failures, or heart attacks, and so forth, then trying to move into their social worlds, their families, their communities, their civic institutions. And then you end up with their souls, the choices that they have to make. Because in the end, we all make choices under circumstances not of our own choosing, but we still have to make choices. And the choice that we make reflects the characters that we think we are, the kind of persons that we believe we are. And we have to raise the issues of who are we really? And why ought we to be the kind of characters who have hope and faith, sense of struggle, most important is courage to raise the questions and to care enough for ourselves to be much better caretakers of our bodies as well as our communities and our society and world. So these are very profound queries that the angry heart is wrestling with. There's no doubt about it. It's the best of what links between medical science and the art of living are all about. Somebody like Chekhov. I mean, it's interesting that the two greatest playwrights outside of Shakespeare were doctors. I don't think it's an accident. Actually, Friedrich Schiller was a surgeon, and of course Anton Chekhov, who was a country doctor who used to invite the poor into his clinic for free. It goes on to write some of the greatest plays. Schiller also. The Robbers, Mary Stuart for Schiller, The Three Sisters, Cherry Archer. The connection of the art of living and medical science forces us to raise why live, why hope, how to love, how to care for ourselves and others. It's quite a challenge.
And it gets me to dreams in that to mention why dream, but also one of the questions I've asked just about everyone is, if you had a magic wand, if you could change anything, what would it be?
The world?
Yeah. Or do you dare even answer that question?
Yeah, I'm not that kind of dreamer though, but there's nothing wrong with dreaming. My God, it's part of our sense of who we are. I mean, if I could dream, I think I would want persons to be able to discover who they distinctly are, without having to worry about the poverty or health care, child care, or jobs that don't pay enough. So they would be able to fulfill their potential, whatever it is, without war, without ugly bigotry. I like some conflict. I believe that tension is the very means by which we actually grow. So I would never want a tension-free world among human beings. I just don't like tension that degenerates into vicious conflict that results in injurious harm to people. So I think tension's a positive thing, and somehow we could circumscribe it so it wouldn't degenerate into these vicious things. But no, I'm not a dreamer at all. I simply think in some ways we have to be grateful for whatever we do have, because we're not here that long. And the times that we hear our experiences of beauty, of love, our experiences of faith, of grace, those are very precious moments. And in the end, that's basically what we have. We ought to be grateful for friendship, love, and so forth. How we doing with time, though, y'all? About 20 past. Okay. How we doing? Are we covering the kind of bases you want?
This is great.
Yeah, because I got a 3:30 thing I got to do with now and D. Yeah, I tell her just few little thing. Yeah, so just about 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, she's. No, that's all right. I'll be up. No. This sister, she's something else.
Well, that gets
Good
to my
God.
last question.
Sure.
Which is always, if you were sitting here interviewing yourself about this subject, would there be a question you'd ask that I haven't?
Now, I think that anytime we talk about, fighting different kinds of pressures and stresses, and the results, be it heart disease or what have you, you always have to be cognizant of the strength of those persons who came before, who had more intense forms of stress and pressure, and how did they preserve their dignity? How did they preserve their integrity? How do we learn from our grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers and mothers and fathers? For me, that chain of tradition is indispensable for preserving any kind of sanity, humanity, or health. So, the Holy of Holies, which is both body as well as courage, as well as talent, as well as compassion. How did they keep those alive and vital given the ugly circumstances in which they lived? And how do we build on what they gave us? See, that for me is a source of hope. And we're really here to talk about hope and heart. And in some ways, you define a saint not as a perfect person, but a person who looks at the world through the lens of the heart. If that heart is angry, it's going to be very difficult to keep the lenses clean. If the heart is bitter, it's going to be foggy. You're not going to see too much at all. And yet if that heart is full of compassion, then you'll see illumination and a certain kind of opening owing to a light that love tends to generate in the world. You see. And it's the saint-like folks. It's the John Coltrane's and Fannie Lou Hamer's and Abraham Joshua Heschel's and Dorothy Day's and Mother Teresa's, who may not be the most effective people in the world, but their example keep alive this tradition that I'm talking about. In that sense, they're saints, not because they're perfect. Mother Teresa was wrong on a lot of things, like abortion, but Martin Luther King was wrong on a number of things, like heterosexism. But that's not the crucial thing about them. The crucial thing is they looked at the world through the lens of their hearts. We have parents who like that, ideologically wrong on a lot of things, but if they're looking at the world through the lens of the heart, when they look at you, you know something special going on. And so you can transcend their limitations. You see what I mean? And that's the kind of opening that we need across the board. I don't think it ever happened on a broad scale, but certainly we can keep it alive. That's the issue of tradition would be one that I would raise to myself. Mm-hmm. Very much so. I'm sorry I got to run, y'all.
That's great.
But this has been, I tell you all just let me go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. I'm telling you.
No, this has been
Good
absolutely fabulous.
God Almighty.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.
So,
That was terrific.
Appreciate you all taking the time, and I wish I even had more time, but I've got